have spent a lifetime believing that memory has a texture. Some memories feel coarse and grainy, as if handled too often. Others feel soft and distant, like fabric stored away for years in a drawer scented faintly of lavender. But there are some memories, very few, that feel like silk sliding through your fingers, smooth, weightless, terrifyingly fragile. Those are the memories you dare not touch too often, because you know one day they might tear. And this story, the story of the wedding dress I sewed for a man who never returned, is made of that kind of silk. I was 19, the year the war stole the color from our days. A time when planes painted shadows over our small coastal town, when the streets were filled with rationed queues and whispered fears, when the sea seemed to swallow every hope we sent across it. Yet even in those dark years, I carried within me a kind of foolish, determined light. The belief that love, if held tightly enough, could survive anything. His name was Henry Whitford, and he had the sort of smile that made the world around him soften, as if it too wanted to lean closer to hear what he might say next. I met him in the most ordinary of ways, during a supply delivery at my mother's sewing shop. Though nothing about the way he looked at me felt ordinary, there was something warm, something earnest, something that felt like home in his gaze. And I, who had never known anything beyond the quiet rhythm of needles, threads, and fabrics, felt time become something delicate in his presence. People always imagine wartime love as something dramatic, something fast and consuming. But our love was gentle. It grew between teacups and shared walks, between letters slipped under the shop door, and small moments stolen between his training schedules. He once told me that loving me made the world make sense again, that in the middle of chaos, he could close his eyes and see a future where the two of us lived in peace, perhaps near the sea, perhaps in a little house where I would sew dresses in a sunny room while he read the newspaper by the window. And I, silly girl that I was, believed wholeheartedly that nothing on earth, not even war, could break something so pure. When he told me he would be deployed to France, the world seemed to tilt. I remember gripping the edges of my mother's sewing table as if it were the only stable thing in the universe. He held my face gently between his hands and told me he would return, that I should keep sewing, keep dreaming, keep believing in us. Then, as if speaking a promise into existence, he asked me if I would marry him when the war was over. I didn't cry, not then. I smiled through the ache in my chest and said yes. And the very next morning, I took out the finest fabric we had left, a soft, creamy satin rationed carefully from pre-war stock, and I began to sew the wedding dress I hoped to wear when Henry came home. People imagine sewing a wedding dress in wartime as something romantic, something poetic. But the truth is, it was an act of desperation as much as hope. Every stitch felt like a prayer, every fold of fabric like a plea to whatever force governed fate. I sat night after night by the soft glow of the oil lamp, guiding the satin under my needle while blackout curtains smothered the world outside. Sometimes the sirens howled, shaking the glass panes, and I would pause, my hands trembling, my breath caught between fear and faith. But I always returned to the dress, to the one thing I could control, to the one thing that felt still mine in a world unraveling thread by thread. Henry wrote whenever he could. His letters smelled faintly of earth and smoke, the scent of trenches and cold nights. He told me about the French villages he passed, their stone walls scarred by shells yet still standing with the stubborn defiance of ordinary people trying to live through extraordinary horror. He described the faces of children who smiled despite hunger, of soldiers who joked despite fear, of the sky that sometimes turned crimson at dawn, as if mourning the night that had passed. But he never wrote about danger, never about death. He spared me that. Instead, he wrote about me, about the dress he imagined me sewing, about the wedding day he carried in his pocket like a charm, a day he swore he would survive to see. I kept his letters tied with a ribbon in a small box beside my bed. Some nights I would reread them until my eyes burned, until the weight of longing stole my sleep. Other nights I held the letters to my chest, pretending his heartbeat was pressed against mine, and whenever fear crept into my mind, fear of loss, fear of silence, fear of the unnamed horrors newspapers hinted at but never fully described, I returned to the wedding dress. The satin was warm under my hands, almost alive, as if absorbing every ounce of devotion I poured into it. I embroidered tiny pearls along the neckline, added a row of delicate lace to the sleeves, stitched a thin line of hope into every seam. It became more than fabric. It became a promise I refused to surrender. But war is a thief that takes not only lives but time. Weeks blurred into months, months into nearly a year. And then, one cold afternoon that tasted of iron and dread, the letter came. Not from Henry, not in his handwriting, but from the War Office, its seal pressed deep into the paper like a wound. I remember turning the envelope over in my hands, feeling its weight, sensing the truth before I opened it. When I finally slid my finger under the flap, the world seemed to fall silent around me. The words were formal, clinical, sharpened by the cruel efficiency of loss, missing in action, presumed dead. I didn't scream. I didn't collapse. I simply folded the letter and placed it inside the box where all the others lay, the ones filled with hope and tenderness. And then, I walked upstairs, opened the wooden chest where I had kept the wedding dress, and stared at it for a long time. It looked exactly as it had before. Luminous, flawless, waiting, mocking me, or mourning with me. I couldn't tell. I closed the lid gently, as if afraid the memories might spill out. I told myself I would look again in a few days. But days became weeks. Weeks became years. And the dress remained untouched, a relic of a life interrupted. People expect grief to be loud, dramatic, visible. Mine was quiet. A soft ache tucked under layers of daily routine. I continued sewing for the shop because life must go on even when hearts don't. Customers brought their mending, their ration vouchers, their worries. I smiled politely, stitched hems, repaired collars, altered uniforms, all the while keeping my sorrow folded neatly inside me like the dress I couldn't bear to see again. Sometimes, alone at night, I would imagine Henry somewhere in the French countryside, injured but alive, trying to make his way back to me. Sometimes I imagined him cold and still beneath foreign soil. Sometimes, unable to bear either thought, I imagined nothing at all. The war ended with fireworks and shouting, with people dancing in the streets and hugging strangers. But I stood at my window, feeling nothing but the steady beat of survival in my chest. Peace had returned to the world, but it had not returned to me. My peace was buried somewhere I would never find. Peace returned to the world like a loud celebration happening behind a closed door, muffled by the distance between what people felt outside and what I felt inside. I watched them wave flags from windows, watched children chase each other up and down the streets wearing paper crowns made from old newspapers, watched neighbors embrace as if victory were something they could hold with both hands and press to their hearts. But for me, victory tasted hollow. I stood there, with my palms resting on the windowsill, staring at a future that seemed thinner than smoke, and all I could think was that peace had come too late for the one person I wanted most to share it with. It felt like standing on the shore of a calm sea, knowing that somewhere beneath the surface lay the wreckage of a ship that would never rise again. For a long time, I tried to bury the memories the same way I had buried the wedding dress, deep, untouched, sealed. Some days I succeeded. Other days the slightest thing could undo me. The sight of a couple holding hands, the distant sound of a marching band practicing for post-war parades, a young soldier passing through town with a familiar gait that made my heart leap before my mind could stop it. But grief is not a straight line. It coils and uncoils, retreats and returns. And sometimes it arrives without knocking, sitting beside you in the quiet of early morning as you pretend you're still asleep so you don't have to face your own thoughts just yet. I suppose that's why I stayed in my mother's shop for so many years, stitching others back together while I fell apart in ways no one could see. There was comfort in the predictable rhythm of needle and thread, a sense of control in watching torn seams become whole again under my hands. If only hearts could be mended as easily as hems. If only love could be reinforced with the same certainty as a double stitch. Sometimes I would imagine Henry standing behind me as I worked, his warm breath brushing against my neck, his voice telling me that I had done enough, that I should rest, that he never meant for my life to shrink into this small, dim space. Other times I imagined nothing at all, letting the numbness dull the ache. Years passed. My mother grew older, and I became the one who kept the shop running, taking in orders from brides who dreamed of futures I once thought were guaranteed. Every wedding dress I made felt like a quiet bruise, a reminder of the one I had sewn for myself. White, perfect, untouched by time yet never worn. Whenever a bride stood before the mirror twisting gracefully, imagining herself walking down the aisle toward the man she loved, I felt both tenderness and sorrow. I wanted to believe their stories would have endings brighter than mine. I wanted to believe the world had changed enough to allow that. But some part of me remained suspended in the war years, tethered by longing and unfinished dreams. I turned down proposals, several of them in fact. Good men, kind men. Men who would have offered stability, companionship, perhaps even a gentler kind of love. But each time someone expressed interest, something inside me recoiled. It wasn't loyalty to a ghost, though people sometimes whispered that behind my back. It was something quieter, heavier, the knowledge that I had already given the truest, most unguarded part of myself to someone who had taken it with him into the silence of a vanished battlefield. I wasn't holding on to Henry. I was holding on to the version of myself I had been when I loved him. The girl who believed in tomorrow. The girl who believed in forever. Letting go of him felt like letting go of her too. But life has a way of thawing even the deepest winters of the heart. Though it does so slowly, gently, almost imperceptibly. By the time I reached my late 50s, the sharp edges of grief had worn themselves smooth. I still kept the wedding dress hidden in its wooden chest, but I no longer avoided thinking about it. Sometimes, late at night, I would climb the stairs to the small attic room where I had placed the chest years earlier. I would sit on the floorboards and rest my hand on the lid, feeling the grain of the wood beneath my fingertips. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. It was enough to know it was there, a relic of a chapter I had survived, a symbol of love both blessed and cursed by the cruelty of fate. It was during one of those quiet years, a warm afternoon in late summer, that my life was interrupted again, not by loss this time, but by something unexpected. A soft knock at my door. I remember wiping my hands on my apron, expecting a customer who had come after hours, or perhaps a neighbor with a question. Instead, when I opened the door, I found a man standing on my doorstep, holding a leather satchel that looked older than he was. His eyes, clear, earnest, tinged with something I recognized but couldn't name, met mine with a strange mixture of apprehension and hope. "Mrs. Hartwell?" he asked softly. "That depends," I replied. "Who's asking?" "My name is Daniel Whitford," he said. I believe you knew my uncle." At first, the name made no connection in my mind, as if my thoughts had rusted from disuse. Then it hit me. Not the name, but the way he stood. The way he held that satchel against his chest. The way his voice trembled ever so slightly. For a moment I thought I was looking at Henry himself, not because they looked alike, but because they carried the same quiet sincerity in their posture, the same haunted gentleness in their eyes. "I'm sorry," I whispered, stepping back as if the floor had shifted beneath me. "I don't understand." Daniel swallowed hard and opened the satchel. Inside, wrapped carefully in a weathered cloth, was something that made my heart lurch so violently I had to grip the door frame to steady myself. A packet of old letters, tied with a faded blue ribbon, and beneath them, a photograph of Henry in uniform, smiling in a way I had never seen before. Younger, softer, almost carefree. "Where did you get this?" I asked, my voice thin. "It was found among my father's belongings," he said. "He kept them all these years, and he asked me, if I ever discovered who these belonged to return them." I felt the world contracting into a single, fragile moment. Letters. His letters. Not the ones he had sent me. Those I had kept all my life. But letters he had written and never been able to send. "May I?" I whispered. Daniel nodded and handed them to me. My hands trembled as I untied the ribbon, the fabric nearly disintegrating beneath my touch. I unfolded the first letter, and before I had read more than a few lines, tears blurred the ink. He had written to me from a field hospital deep in France, describing an injury that had kept him from returning to his unit. He wrote about the villagers who took him in, the old woman who bandaged his wounds, the little girl who brought him flowers each morning. the fear he felt knowing the front was moving closer. He wrote about me, always about me, about the dress he imagined I was sewing, about the life he dreamed of returning to, about the promise that kept him fighting even when he could barely stand. But then the letters changed. The tone grew darker, the sentences shorter, the fear sharper. He had been captured, moved from place to place, no record, no certainty, only fading hope. And the last letter, unfinished, the ink smudged as if he were dragged away before completing it, held only one line that broke me completely. If I do not return, tell her I never stopped trying to. I pressed the letter against my chest, as if I could somehow feel his heartbeat echo through the decades. And in that moment, something inside me that had been frozen for more than 30 years cracked open, not in pain this time, but in overwhelming, consuming gratitude. He had not abandoned me. He had not stopped loving me. He had fought until the very end to come back, and yet, even as relief washed through me like a tide finally reaching a long-abandoned shore, another emotion rose quietly beneath it. Something softer, something aching, something almost like regret. Not regret for loving him, nor regret for waiting, nor regret for the life I had lived without him, but regret for all the years I had spent believing he had vanished without a trace, for all the nights I had lain awake wondering if he had forgotten me. For every moment I had doubted the strength of what we shared. Grief had convinced me I had been left behind. These letters were proof that I had been carried with him through nights darker than anything I had imagined. Daniel remained standing silently beside me as I wept, as if he understood instinctively that this was a moment he had no right to intrude upon. When I finally looked up at him, my hands still trembling around the letters, he gave me a small, respectful nod. "There's more," he said gently. If you're willing." I invited him inside, my body moving on instinct rather than thought. The room seemed unfamiliar as I led him to the small kitchen table, as if grief, memory, and revelation had rearranged the very space around me. Daniel set the satchel down and removed another bundle, this one larger, wrapped in what looked like the remnants of a military blanket. He unfolded it carefully, as though handling something sacred, and revealed an old journal with frayed edges and pages yellowed by time and damp. My breath caught again when I recognized the handwriting on the cover, sharper than the letters, slightly angled, but unmistakably his field journal. Daniel said quietly, "My father found it among confiscated belongings after the liberation. He never had the courage to open it, but he kept it safe, for you." My fingers hovered above the cover, trembling with a mixture of anticipation and fear. It felt almost like reaching through time itself, touching the thoughts Henry had never intended for anyone else to read. I hesitated, not out of doubt, but out of reverence. Then, with a slow breath, I opened the journal. The first pages described his early days in France, the exhaustion of marches, the suffocating mud of the trenches, the faces of young men who joked loudly to hide their terror. He wrote about missing me, about imagining my hands guiding the satin under the needle, about dreaming of the moment he would lift my veil and see me looking back at him with all the hope he carried in his heart. His words were tender, almost unbearably so, and I found myself tracing the ink with my fingertips as though the letters themselves were alive. But then the tone shifted, gradually at first, then sharply. Descriptions of hunger, cold, disease spreading through the ranks, the growing certainty that their unit had been sent into something they were never expected to survive. He wrote about the explosion, how he had been thrown against a stone wall, how pain had swallowed him whole, how he awoke to the sound of French voices calling his name. He described the farmhouse where he recovered, the family who took him in, the night he learned his entire unit had been lost. And then came the entry that shattered me more than any other. He wrote about learning that communication lines had collapsed, that letters could no longer be sent, that the British Army believed him dead. He wrote about the horror of imagining me receiving the telegram, about wanting to claw his way back across the channel just to tell me he was alive. He wrote about trying to escape once he had healed, only to be found, captured, transported to a camp where the world shrank into hunger, cold metal bars, and the constant countdown of fading hope. "I don't know if she believes I gave up," he wrote. "I don't know if she thinks I forgot. If this journal is ever found, Let her know I crossed every mile twice in my mind just to reach her. I pressed my hand over my mouth, trying to keep the sob from escaping. But grief is a living thing. It does not obey. Daniel sat quietly, his presence steady and respectful, his eyes soft with understanding. For him, this was family history. For me, it was the restoration of a truth I hadn't even known was missing. We spent hours together at that table, reading through every page, uncovering fragments of Henry's journey that had been buried under decades of silence. Daniel showed me a small envelope that had been sealed inside the back pocket of the journal. My name was written on it in hurried strokes, as though he had written it by lantern light, knowing time was running out. With shaking fingers, I opened it. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper, worn almost to transparency. His final message: "My dearest Eleanor, if this letter reaches you, it means I could not. But know that I walked toward you until my feet could no longer carry me. I loved you with a love that outlived even the hope of returning. If you ever sew again, sew something for yourself. Live. Laugh. Let the world touch you again. And if you ever touch the dress you made for our wedding, know that I saw you in it every time I closed my eyes. Yours. Always. Henry." I don't remember falling to my knees, but I remember Daniel catching me before I hit the floor. I remember clutching that letter to my chest as though pressing it against my heart could make up for all the years I had believed it had stopped beating for me. I remember whispering his name over and over, as though speaking it aloud could bring him closer, even for a moment. After I regained my breath, Daniel helped me sit again, and we talked until dusk softened the edges of the room. He told me that his father had spent the rest of his life haunted by the fact that he had survived where others had not. He said returning the letters and journal was the one thing he felt he owed, not just to Henry, but to me. When Daniel finally rose to leave, he hesitated at the door. "There's something else," he said. "Something I found in the satchel. I think he meant it for you." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, battered by age. My heart clenched as I recognized it instantly. The ring. The engagement ring he had planned to place on my finger. He placed it gently in my hand, and for a long moment, I couldn't breathe. It was simple, delicate. A small gem set in gold that had dulled with time, yet still caught the light in a way that seemed alive. "Thank you," I whispered. And I meant it more deeply than I had meant anything in years. After Daniel left, the house felt both emptier and somehow fuller. I sat at the table surrounded by letters, journals, memories resurrected from ashes I had long believed cold, and for the first time in decades, I felt the faintest stirring of something I had thought I buried forever. Hope. Not hope that he might return, but hope that the love we had shared could finally rest, honored and understood, no longer trapped in the ambiguity of missing inaction. That night, I climbed the stairs to the attic. I lit a candle. I opened the wooden chest. The wedding dress lay exactly as I had left it. Soft, luminous, waiting. But it no longer mocked me. It no longer felt like a monument to what I had lost. It felt like a testament to what had endured. And it was then, with the candlelight flickering across the satin, that I finally allowed myself to touch it again. The satin felt different beneath my fingertips than it had decades earlier. Not colder, not stiffer, not faded, but transformed. It was no longer a symbol of a future denied. It had become a vessel for every heartbeat that had passed between the girl I used to be and the woman I had become. As I ran my hand slowly over the bodice, the pearls caught the candlelight like tiny constellations, and for the first time in so many years that I had lost count, I did not feel the sharp stab of anguish that always accompanied thoughts of the dress. Instead, I felt something deeper, something quieter, a kind of peace I had not believed was meant for me. I lifted the dress out of the chest with both hands, careful not to let it drag, as though it were a living thing that could bruise if handled too roughly. The weight of it surprised me. It seemed heavier than I remembered, or perhaps I had grown smaller under the weight of time. I carried it to the small attic window where moonlight filtered through the glass, soft and pale, illuminating the folds of fabric like water flowing from a dream. For a long moment, I simply stood there, holding the dress against my body, imagining, not painfully this time, but tenderly, the version of myself who had once believed she would wear it walking toward the man she loved. And then, an unexpected sense of resolve stirred inside me. Not grief, not longing, but purpose. For years I had tried to bury this chapter of my life, telling myself that silence was the only way to protect what was left of me. But now, with the truth finally unearthed and placed gently in my hands, I realized that silence had never protected me at all. It had kept me suspended in a perpetual winter, unable to move forward or backward. The letters, the journal, the ring, they had all been carried to me across a distance I could barely comprehend, through the hands of men who had survived what Henry had not. It felt almost like a final gift, a soft insistence that I could not end my life without honoring the one he had tried so desperately to return to. And so I made a decision that startled even me. I decided to wear the dress. Not as a bride, not for a wedding, but for closure, for memory, for gratitude, for the girl I had once been, and for the man whose love had shaped the entire trajectory of my existence. The next morning, I carried the dress downstairs and laid it across my bed. I brewed tea with hands that trembled slightly, not from sorrow, but from the gravity of what I was preparing myself to do. I knew I could not put the dress on alone. The fastenings were delicate, the fabric too precious for me to risk tearing. I stood for a long time considering who, if anyone, I could ask for help. My mother had passed away years earlier. Most of my old friends had moved, married, scattered to new towns, their lives spreading outward like ripples on water I no longer touched. And then I thought of Clara, my neighbor who lived 2 doors down. She was younger than me by nearly 15 years, the sort of woman who carried warmth in her voice and kindness in her eyes. She had always sensed there was a story behind my quietness. Though she had never pressed, I trusted her. And more importantly, I felt she would understand what the moment meant, even without knowing the details. When I knocked on her door that morning, she opened it with flour dusting her hands, the scent of warm bread drifting into the hallway. "Eleanor?" she said, surprised. "Is everything all right? I need a favor," I said softly. "A very personal one." She wiped her hands, nodded, and took her shawl. "Of course. Tell me what you need." I led her into my home and up the stairs, where the dress lay waiting. Her breath caught the moment she saw it. "Oh my, it's beautiful," she whispered. "Is it yours?" "It was meant to be," I replied, my voice steady but filled with decades of unspoken memory. "I would like to put it on. Just once. For myself." Clara looked at me with an expression so gentle, so deeply human, that it broke something open inside me. Without asking questions, without prying into wounds she sensed were sacred, she nodded and stepped beside me. Together, we lifted the dress. Together, we unfolded its layers. Together, we guided it over my head, careful not to disturb the pearls or the fragile lace at the sleeves. When the fabric settled over me, flowing down to brush my ankles, the world seemed to go quiet, as if time itself were holding its breath. Clara fastened the tiny buttons along the back, her fingers delicate but certain. When the last one was in place, she stepped back with a soft gasp. "Eleanor," she whispered, a hand over her heart, "you look radiant, like someone who has been waiting her whole life for this moment." Tears blurred my vision, but not from sadness. Not this time. I walked to the mirror, an old piece with an ornate gold frame that had belonged to my mother, and I saw myself reflected, not as the woman I had become, but as all the versions of myself layered together. The hopeful girl, the grieving young woman, the quiet seamstress, the survivor of a love interrupted by war, and now, finally, the woman who had allowed herself to remember without breaking. "It suits you," Clara said softly. "It was made for a different life," I replied. "But perhaps it can bless the one I have lived instead." Clara's eyes glistened. "Do you want some time alone?" I nodded. She kissed my cheek, squeezed my hands, and left the room quietly. For the next hour, I stood in front of the mirror, simply breathing, remembering, honoring. I thought of Henry's smile, the way he had brushed a strand of hair behind my ear the last time we saw each other, the promise in his eyes when he asked me to marry him. I thought of the letters he wrote from places too dangerous to imagine, the journal entries stained with hope and fear, the final note that had crossed impossible distances to reach me, and I whispered softly into the quiet, "I know now. I know you never stopped trying." The dress held me gently, like an embrace that had taken decades to reach me. When I finally removed it, folding it carefully back into its chest, I felt lighter, not healed, not entirely, but freed. The past had been returned to me piece by piece, and now I was ready to decide what to do with it. In the days that followed, something in me shifted so subtly that at first I didn't recognize it. It wasn't joy. Joy felt too bright, too sharp for a heart that had spent decades wrapped in quiet shadows. It wasn't sadness either. I had lived with sadness for so long it had become a second skin. No, this was something gentler, like the faint warmth of early spring after a long winter. A slow thawing, a loosening of the invisible threads that had kept me anchored to a version of the past that was incomplete, uncertain, unfinished. Wearing the dress had awakened a part of myself I had forgotten existed. The part capable of feeling without fear, the part capable of remembering without collapsing, the part capable of standing in the present without constantly reaching back toward what might have been. I found myself humming while I sewed, something I hadn't done since I was a girl. I found myself opening the windows in the morning to let in the salt-kissed breeze from the sea. I found myself noticing the small, beautiful things in the world again, the way sunlight filtered through lace curtains, the sound of children playing in the square, the delicate blooming of the rosebush outside my door that had survived harsher seasons than I ever could. But something else happened too, something unexpected. My dreams changed. For decades, my dreams had been haunted by unfinished scenes. Henry calling my name from a distance I could never cross, letters slipping from my fingers into unreachable places, a wedding dress hanging in shadow like a ghost. But after wearing the dress, the dreams softened. Henry appeared not as a specter, not as a wound, but as a memory, warm, familiar, steady. He no longer stood on the edge of fading horizons. Instead, he sat with me at the foot of my bed, smiling the way he used to, telling me stories of villages I would never see and fields he longed to return to. Sometimes he simply looked at me, as though trying to assure me that letting go would not be the same as forgetting. And for the first time, I believed him. One afternoon, as I sat in the shop adjusting the hem of a tea dress for a bride-to-be, Clara stopped by with a basket of fresh loaves from the bakery. Her cheeks were flushed from the heat, strands of hair clinging to her forehead. She smiled at me, but there was something hesitant in her expression, as if she wanted to say something but wasn't sure how. "Eleanor," she began gently, "may I ask you something?" "Of course," I said, setting aside my work. She bit her lip. "That day, when you asked me to help you with the dress, it felt important. Not just nostalgic, but transformative. You've seemed different since then. Lighter. Free, even. I was wondering, is there anything more you need? Anything you wish to do with the dress now?" Her question lingered in the air like a soft echo. It was something I had been asking myself as well. "The dress is part of my story," I said slowly, "but I don't want it to fade away with me. Not now that I understand the whole truth." Clara's eyes brightened. "Then maybe it's time to share it." I considered her words, letting them settle inside me. For so long, the dress had been my burden and my sanctuary. But now, with Henry's letters in my hands and the certainty of his love restored, I felt something greater stirring. A quiet wish that our story might live beyond the confines of my attic chest. That night, I lay in bed thinking of the museum at the edge of town, the one dedicated to preserving wartime memories, filled with artifacts donated by families who had lost fathers, brothers, sons, husbands. I had visited it once years ago, standing before glass cases containing medals whose shine had not dulled with sorrow, uniforms patched by trembling hands, photographs of couples separated by oceans and fate. Perhaps the dress belonged there too, not as a symbol of tragedy, but as a testament to devotion, resilience, and love that endured even when life did not. The decision settled gently in my heart. The next morning, I folded the dress carefully into its wooden chest, placed Henry's letters on top, and walked to the museum with steps that felt both heavy and purposeful. The building was quiet when I entered, the air cool and still, carrying the faint scent of old wood and stories preserved in silence. The curator, a woman with silver hair and kind eyes, greeted me warmly. When I explained why I had come, her expression softened into one of reverent gravity. "May I see it?" she asked. I opened the chest. When she lifted the dress from within, the sunlight caught the satin in a way that made it glow, as though it were illuminated from within. Her breath trembled. "It's exquisite," she whispered. "A piece of artistry and of history." She asked me to tell her my story. For the first time in my life, I told it, all of it, without faltering. Every word felt like a release. By the time I finished, tears shimmered in her eyes. "Eleanor," she said, "if you are willing, this dress deserves a place where others can feel what you have carried all these years. It deserves to be seen, and your story deserves to be heard." I nodded. I didn't trust myself to speak. Arrangements were made. The dress would be displayed in a glass case, accompanied by Henry's letters and journal, each piece carefully preserved, each page protected. The curator promised the exhibit would honor both of us, with dignity, with tenderness, with truth. The night before the installation, I returned home feeling strangely restless. I made myself tea but didn't drink it. I sat by the window but didn't truly look outside. It took time before I realized what the feeling was. It was the final unraveling of a thread that had bound me for most of my life. It was release. The next morning, I attended the opening of the exhibit. People gathered around the display, murmuring softly, their eyes tracing the delicate craftsmanship of the dress, the faded ink of Henry's words. Some cried quietly. Others simply stood still, absorbing it, letting the story settle into them. And I, hidden among the small crowd, felt something I had not expected to feel. Pride, not in the suffering I had endured, but in the love I had lived. As I watched strangers lean closer to read Henry's final message, I understood something with crystalline clarity. This dress had never been a symbol of loss. It had always been a symbol of love that war could not extinguish. "Are you all right?" Clara whispered beside me. "Yes," I said, a soft smile forming. "For the first time, I truly am." As the museum lights dimmed for the evening and the last visitors drifted out with softened hearts, I lingered a moment longer before the glass case, feeling a strange, almost sacred stillness settle around me. The dress, my dress, no longer looked like an artifact of sorrow. Standing there beneath the gentle glow of the overhead lamps, it looked like a testament to a love that had carved itself into the fabric of an entire lifetime. And in that quiet, suspended moment, I understood something with a clarity that pierced me gently, like the first warm sun after years of winter. I had spent decades believing my story had been frozen at the moment I lost him, believing my life had become a museum of what might have been. But as I gazed at the dress now, surrounded by people who felt moved by a love they had never lived, I realized that my story had never been trapped in the past. It had simply been waiting for truth, waiting for time, waiting for the courage to be seen. Henry's words were beside me in a fragile display of ink and memory. But for the first time, they no longer felt like the echo of a life interrupted. They felt like a guiding hand resting gently on my shoulder, urging me forward, reminding me that love does not end where life does. It continues, in the choices we make, in the quiet we survive, in the grace with which we allow ourselves to keep living. I placed my palms softly against the cool glass, knowing my reflection would hover there long after I stepped away. And with a breath that felt like turning a final page, I whispered a promise only he and I would ever truly understand. "I carried you this far. Now, let me carry myself." Then I walked out of the museum, the evening air brushing my face with a softness I hadn't felt in years. And for the first time in a very long time, I did not feel alone. When I stepped out of the museum that evening, the sky was fading from soft gold into the gentle indigo of approaching night, and the hush of the world felt like a blessing I hadn't known I still deserved. The streets were quiet, the glow of the lampposts trembling slightly in the breeze, and as I walked home, I felt something unusual stirring in me, not sorrow, not even nostalgia, but a sense of unfolding, as though life itself were gently, cautiously expanding around me after years of being held in a narrow shape. It felt strange to breathe so freely, to walk without the invisible weight that had pressed on my shoulders for decades, to feel the air touch my skin without that familiar ache of memory dragging behind me like a shadow. I thought, as I walked, of how long I had lived in the half-light between grief and survival, expecting nothing new from the future, believing that whatever life had left to offer would be shallow reflections of what I had lost. Yet now, with the truth of Henry's love placed firmly, tenderly back into my hands, I found myself wondering whether life still held unknown corners for me. Quiet corners, gentle corners, corners where a woman like me, shaped by both endurance and longing, might still unfold into something unexpected. I didn't know what such a possibility might look like. I didn't dare imagine too boldly. But for the first time in years, the absence of pain left enough space inside me for curiosity to breathe. When I reached my door, the house greeted me with its familiar silence. For so long, that silence had echoed impossibly loud, filled with the ghosts of years I could never reclaim. But tonight, it felt peaceful, not empty. As I entered, I paused by the sewing table where so many of my days had been spent bending over fabric, mending what strangers had placed in my hands. It struck me then that I had spent most of my life restoring the lives of others with thread, yet had never truly allowed myself to mend in the same way. Perhaps that was about to change. I set water to boil for tea, moving slowly, thoughtfully. The house felt different tonight. Not because anything physical had changed, but because I had. Grief, when carried for too long, becomes a lens through which the entire world is filtered, rendering even moments of beauty muted and distant. But standing there with the kettle humming and the faint scent of chamomile filling the kitchen, I felt, for the first time, a shift in the lens, a quiet widening. Later that night, I sat by the window with my journal. It had been years since I had written more than scattered notes, grocery lists, measurements for clients, reminders about appointments. But now I felt an urge I couldn't quite explain. The need to place words onto paper, not for memory, not for posterity, but simply because there were feelings inside me that needed space to rest. I wrote about the museum, about the people who had stood before the dress with softened eyes, about the way the light had touched the satin like a caress. I wrote about Daniel, about the heaviness and gentleness in his presence, about the quiet respect he had shown while delivering pieces of my heart I never expected to see again. And then, unexpectedly, my pen lingered on his name, my breath caught, not from discomfort, but from realization. For the past few days, my thoughts had returned to Daniel without my noticing. The way he had stood silently, giving me space to break and heal. The way he had carried the weight of his father's guilt with honor rather than bitterness. The way his eyes had softened when he looked at me, not with pity, but with understanding. He had the same sincerity that Henry once carried in every gesture. Not the same presence, not the same warmth, but a familiar kind, one that didn't haunt or hurt, one that comforted instead of opening old wounds. Still, I reminded myself gently, it was too soon to assign meaning to the way his presence lingered in my thoughts. Gratitude could be mistaken for connection. Memory could masquerade as longing. My heart, tender and newly opened, was not yet stable enough to trust its own reflections, and yet, I could not deny that some quiet part of me had awakened, like a seed long dormant finally feeling the light. The following morning, I went back to the museum, not because I needed to, but because something in me wanted to see the dress again, to see it in its new home. To reassure myself that I had made the right decision, the curator greeted me warmly. "Would you like a moment alone with it?" she asked. I nodded. Standing before the glass case once more, I let my eyes trace every fold of satin, every curve of lace. It felt different now, not like something I had lost, but like something I had finally set free. This dress, once a symbol of an interrupted future, had become a vessel of truth, a silent storyteller of devotion, sacrifice, and the kind of love that endured even in absence. As I stood there, lost in thought, a soft voice broke the silence. "I hoped I might find you here." I turned. Daniel stood a few feet away, hands in his pockets, looking almost uncertain. I felt my breath catch in that small, unexpected way that accompanies moments which carry more weight than they initially appear to. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. "I didn't mean to assume. I just thought you might come." "It's all right," I replied. "I find comfort in being here." He stepped closer, his gaze shifting to the dress inside the case. "It's strange," he said softly. "I've seen so many artifacts from the war, medals, uniforms, photographs, but this is the first one that feels alive." "I know what you mean," I whispered. For a moment we stood in silence, not uncomfortable silence, the kind that forms only when two people stand on the edge of something delicate and unspoken. Then Daniel said quietly, "I didn't get the chance to tell you everything. There's more in my father's notes. More about Henry. I wanted to make sure you were ready before I shared it." A thrum passed through me. Not fear, but a solemn readiness. "I think I am," I said. He nodded, relief softening his features. "I could bring it by this afternoon if you like." I hesitated only a moment. "Yes," I said. "I would like that." As we parted ways, I felt a tremor inside me. Not the tremor of old wounds reopening, but the tremor of new paths forming, of unknown chapters unfolding with gentle insistence. When he arrived at my home later that day, the sky had shifted into a calm gray, heavy with the promise of rain. We sat at the table where I had first opened Henry's journal, and Daniel placed a small stack of weathered papers before me. "These were among my father's private letters," he explained. "He never shared them with anyone, not even with me. I only discovered them after he passed." My hands trembled as I reached for the first page. I unfolded the first page with the same care one might use when touching something sacred. The ink had faded in places, washed thin by time or humidity, but the words were still legible enough to carry their weight across decades. Daniel watched me quietly, his posture respectful, his eyes lowered so as not to intrude on the moment, though I could sense the quiet tension beneath his calm, the kind that comes when we open doors that have been locked for far too long. The letter was written in his father's hand, dated months after Henry had disappeared, addressed to no one in particular. It seemed more like a confession than correspondence, an attempt to unburden himself of truths he had been unable to speak aloud. As I read, a slow chill trickled down my spine. He wrote of the night he had found the satchel among reclaimed belongings after a chaotic relocation of prisoners near the end of the war. He recognized Henry's name from the battalion logs. He recognized the photograph inside, the one of me that Henry had carried. But the journal entry that followed was what stole the breath from my lungs. Captain Whitford wrote that he had encountered a soldier during the final weeks of battle, a young man so emaciated, so hollowed by captivity, that he barely resembled the person described in the military records. The man had been delirious, whispering fragments of sentences, clinging to scraps of consciousness. When asked his name, he had murmured, "Whitford, Henry," before collapsing again. They had attempted to move him to safety, but the group had been ambushed during retreat, forced to scatter. In the chaos of gunfire and smoke, Captain Whitford lost sight of him. "I searched for hours," the letter said. "Through mud, through fog, through bodies I prayed were not his. I never found him, and I have carried that failure like a stone in my chest." My hands tightened around the paper, my breath trembling. For a moment, the room felt both impossibly large and suffocatingly small. There had been a moment, one moment, when Henry had still been alive, still reachable, still fighting to return, a single thread of possibility. So fragile, so vanishingly fleeting. Daniel reached for the next page and offered it to me gently, as though sensing that words might fail me. This one was written years later, long after the war had ended. Captain Whitford described a recurring dream that haunted him. A soldier standing in a field of tall grass, calling out for someone he could not reach. The captain believed the dream was Henry's memory, trying to find its way back to him. Or perhaps his own guilt, manifesting in the shape of a man he couldn't save. Then came the line that struck me hardest. "I do not know if Henry lived another hour or another day after that night, but I know with certainty that he died searching for her." I set the papers down, unable to breathe. My chest felt as if it were unraveling from the inside, loosening threads I had held tight for a lifetime. The silence between us thickened, not heavy with sorrow, but with the enormity of truth finally spoken aloud. Daniel watched me with gentle eyes. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "I didn't want to overwhelm you." "You didn't," I said, though my voice was barely sound. This is something I needed to know, even if it hurts." He nodded, understanding. "I believe that's why my father kept these letters. He wanted someone to hear the truth, someone who deserved to hear it." We sat quietly for a long while. The rain began outside, soft at first, then steady, pattering against the windows like fingertips tapping rhythmically at forgotten memories. The sound filled the room with a strange comfort, as though the world itself were telling me that grief, even renewed grief, was a sign that something still lived inside me. When I finally lifted my gaze, Daniel's expression had changed. Softer, more vulnerable. "I didn't just come to deliver the letters," he said. "There's something else. Something my father wrote that I wasn't sure whether to share. But I think you deserve the choice." He reached into the satchel again and withdrew a small envelope. This one more tattered than the rest, the edges frayed as though it had been handled often, maybe even feared. "What is it?" I asked. "It's a location," he said. A place he believed might have been where Henry spent his last days. He never confirmed it, but he intended to go there one day. He never found the courage. I thought, maybe you should see it. My heart thudded heavy and uneven in my chest. The idea of visiting such a place, of standing where Henry may have taken his last breaths, made my skin prickle with both longing and dread. "I don't know if I can," I whispered. Daniel nodded. "You don't have to decide now, or ever. But if you choose to go, I would go with you." The room fell into a silence so tender, it felt like a pulse between us. A silence that did not demand or push or break. A silence that invited. I looked down at the papers scattered across the table. Henry's journal, the unfinished letters, Captain Whitford's confessions, pieces of a man I had loved, piecing together the last parts of a story I had believed ended abruptly, but had instead been stretched across time like a distant echo. For decades, I had lived with the idea of missing in action, missing in memory, missing in truth, missing in closure. But now, for the first time, I felt something different blooming in the space where that emptiness had once lived. Not an ending, not even healing, but possibility. I said slowly, "I think I need time to understand what this means." Daniel nodded. "Of course. Take all the time you need." But even as I said it, I knew time alone would not be enough. Not this time. Not for this truth. Because a question had taken root inside me, a question that grew quietly, insistently, like a seed breaking open beneath warm soil. If I stood where he stood, if I walked the ground he last walked, would I feel him one last time? The thought both terrified and comforted me. Daniel rose to leave, but paused by the door. "Eleanor," he said, "whatever you decide, you won't face it alone." And as the door closed softly behind him, I felt tears gather in my eyes. Not from sorrow, but from the gentle shock of knowing that someone had finally stepped into my life, not to replace what I lost, but to help me carry what remained. After Daniel left, the house settled back into its familiar quiet, but it no longer felt hollow. Instead, it felt as though every corner held a soft, lingering vibration, like footsteps that had just passed, but left an echo in the floorboards. The letters were still on the table, the journal still open to a page where Henry had written my name with a tenderness that reached across time to touch parts of me I thought had gone numb. The envelope containing the possible location of his last days lay near my teacup, small and unassuming yet heavy with a gravity almost impossible to define. I sat there for a long time, listening to the rain outside, feeling its rhythmic tapping seep into my bones, grounding me in the present, even as my mind drifted into the past. I felt as though two versions of myself were sitting in that room, the woman I had grown into, and the girl who had once sat in this same house, sewing a wedding dress while believing that love could outlive any war. And somewhere between them, I sensed a third presence, the possibility of who I might still become. When the rain finally stopped, the world outside had taken on that peculiar stillness that follows a storm. a calm so profound it seems almost reverent. I rose from the table, collected the letters with careful hands, and placed them back into the satchel. Then I walked to the window and looked out at the street, glistening with rainwater that reflected the lamplight like scattered fragments of gold. It occurred to me then that I had spent most of my life trapped between too much knowing and not enough. I had known Henry was gone, but not how. I had known he loved me, but not how much. I had known my grief, but not its origins. Now I knew everything, and yet it felt like only the beginning of understanding. For the next few weeks, I lived in a kind of quiet transition. There were days when I felt strong enough to reread the journal, to trace each line of Henry's handwriting and feel the warmth of him through the paper. There were other days when I tucked everything away, unable to bear the weight of memories so fresh they felt like recent wounds. I sewed dresses, repaired jackets, hemmed curtains, the familiar rhythm soothing me, reminding me that life could be stitched back together even when the fabric seemed too thin to hold. Daniel visited often, at first to check on me, later simply because our conversations began to stretch longer, settling into a comfortable cadence. Sometimes he brought fresh bread from the bakery, sometimes flowers plucked from the fields outside town, sometimes nothing at all except his quiet company. He listened when I spoke, and when I didn't, he held space with a gentleness I had not expected but deeply appreciated. One afternoon, as we walked through the market square, he asked softly, "Have you thought about the envelope?" I felt a twist inside me, not of fear, but of longing. "I think about it every day," I admitted, "but I haven't decided." He nodded as though he understood exactly what I meant. "There's no deadline," he said, "but whenever you're ready, I'll help you." The way he said it, without pressure, without expectation, made something inside me soften. That evening, after he left, I lit a candle and brought the envelope to the small writing desk where I used to mend torn seams. The wax flickered gently, casting shadows across the paper. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet, containing a hand-drawn map, a route, coordinates, a name, a remote area in the countryside of northern France, near the outskirts of a village that had been destroyed during the final months of occupation. A place where records suggested a small group of prisoners had been held temporarily during transport. A place Captain Whitford had intended to visit before his guilt swallowed the courage from him. As I stared at the map, tracing the lines with my fingertip, I felt something shift inside me, a slow and steady pull, not unlike standing near the ocean and feeling the tide tug gently at your ankles, inviting you forward. I knew then that I needed to go, not for answers. I had those now. Not for closure. The museum exhibit had given me that, but for something deeper, something for myself. I needed to stand where Henry had stood, to breathe the air he breathed, to let the land hold the last echoes of him before I carried the final echo home. The next morning, I found Daniel waiting at my gate, as though he sensed the moment my heart shifted. "I'm ready," I told him. He didn't smile triumphantly or eagerly. He simply nodded with quiet understanding, as though he had known all along that this day would arrive when my heart could bear it. We traveled 2 days by train, moving through landscapes I had only ever seen in newspapers or heard described in veteran accounts. Rolling fields, dense forests, quiet villages with buildings still bearing scars from decades-old shell fire. The closer we came to northern France, the more the air seemed infused with the memory of conflict. Not loud or violent, but subtle, carried in the way wind moved through the grass, in the silence that lingered between trees. Daniel and I spoke little during the journey, not because there was nothing to say, but because some experiences reshape words, making conversation feel too small for the vastness of what the heart is holding. When we reached the village, what remained of it, we found a small inn with a stone facade and a garden overflowing with lavender. The innkeeper, a woman in her 70s with soft eyes, told us that visitors sometimes came searching for the ghosts of the war, as she put it. Her words settled over me like a soft shroud. I wondered if I had come searching for ghosts too, or perhaps searching for the woman I might become after letting them rest. The next morning, guided by the map, Daniel and I walked along a narrow path leading into a forest. The trees rose high above us, their leaves filtering the sunlight into shifting patches of gold and shadow. The air smelled of earth and moss, and something unnamably ancient. Something that whispered of stories buried but not forgotten. "We're close," Daniel said quietly. My heartbeat quickened, not in fear, but in reverence. I felt as though the very ground beneath my feet recognized me, as though it knew I had come for someone who had once walked here with hope, clinging to him like a thin, desperate shield. At last, the path opened into a clearing, a quiet, unremarkable patch of land. No markers, no ruins, no visible trace of what had once been, and yet, something in me knew. I could feel it, a kind of stillness that resonated deep in my bones. "This is the place," Daniel whispered. "I can feel it." I stepped forward slowly, my breath trembling, my hands clasped before me as though approaching an altar. The wind rustled through the grass, carrying with it the faintest scent of something familiar. The scent of damp earth after rain, the scent of memories older than my own age, the scent of longing preserved in silence, and I felt him, not as a ghost, not as a sorrow, but as a presence woven gently into the earth, into the air, into the quiet. I knelt in the clearing, my hand brushing the blades of grass, my heart cracking open not with pain but with unbearable tenderness. "I'm here," I whispered. "I made it." "You weren't alone." Daniel stood several steps behind, giving me space. The wind moved again, warm and soft, touching my cheek in a way that felt like a caress, a farewell, a welcome, a blessing. I closed my eyes, allowing tears to fall freely, not from grief, but from love finally allowed to rest. I remained kneeling in the clearing for a long time, letting the air settle around me like a quiet embrace, letting the weight of decades lift from my shoulders in a slow, steady exhale. I had imagined this moment so many times throughout my life, imagined finding some trace of him, imagined hearing a whisper carried through the wind, imagined collapsing beneath the grief of unfinished stories. Yet what I felt now was nothing like those imaginings. There was no collapse, no breaking, only softness, only release, only the profound understanding that love, real love, does not end where breath ceases. It lingers. It settles into the world like hidden roots, feeding the soil with memory until even untouched places feel sacred. As I rose slowly to my feet, brushing the grass from my hands, Daniel stepped forward with quiet footsteps, stopping beside me without speaking. I could sense his presence the way one senses warmth. Not intrusive, not overwhelming, simply there, steady and patient, waiting for me to find my own breath again. "Thank you," I murmured, though the words felt too small for the enormity of what this journey had meant. Not just the travel, not just the discovery, but the courage to walk into the last chapter of a story I never thought I would touch again. Daniel nodded, his expression tender. "You don't owe me thanks. I'm honored you allowed me to be here." I looked around the clearing once more. The sunlight filtered through the trees in long golden rays, casting shifting patterns across the ground. I imagined Henry seeing this same scene under different circumstances, frightened, exhausted, but still holding onto the thread of hope that connected him to me. And what struck me, more deeply than anything else, was the certainty that he had not died in despair. He had died trying to return. He had died with love at the forefront of his mind. "I think he would be at peace knowing you came," Daniel said softly, "knowing you found this place." "Perhaps," I whispered. "Or perhaps he always knew I'd find him eventually." A soft wind stirred the leaves, and I couldn't help but smile. We walked back toward the village in silence. Not because there was nothing to say, but because some moments are too sacred to be interrupted by words. The path felt different on the way back. Wider somehow, gentler, as though the forest itself had softened its stance after witnessing the completion of a long, unfinished journey. That evening, back at the inn, I found myself unable to sleep. I sat by the window listening to the quiet hum of night, the scent of lavender drifting up from the garden below. My thoughts drifted through memories like pages turning in a cherished book. The girl I had been, the woman I had become, the fragments of life that had shaped me in ways I had not understood until now. And woven through it all, like a delicate thread, was Henry, not as a ghost haunting me, but as a steady presence guiding me toward truths I had avoided confronting. It occurred to me then that grief is not a story with a single ending. It is a story with many endings, some quiet, some sudden, some arriving decades later in the shape of a letter, a journal, a map leading to a forest clearing where the past finally exhales its secrets. And though I had thought the wedding dress was the final relic of our love, I realized now that it had been only the beginning of understanding. The next morning, Daniel knocked gently on my door. His hair was slightly mussed, his expression thoughtful, as though he too had spent the night turning over the weight of everything we had witnessed. "May I?" he asked. I nodded and stepped aside to let him in. He handed me a small envelope. "The innkeeper wanted you to have this. She said she found it behind the reception desk. A letter someone left years ago. She never knew who it was meant for until she heard your story." My pulse quickened. "A letter? It's old," he said. "Very old." I opened the envelope with trembling hands. The paper inside was fragile, worn by time. When I unfolded it, my breath caught. It was written in elegant penmanship, dated near the end of the war. A letter from the French family who had sheltered Henry. They had tried to send it through multiple channels, but communication lines were unstable, mail frequently lost or intercepted. Somehow, impossibly, this letter had found its way here, waiting decades in a quiet inn, as though held by fate until the moment I was ready. The message was simple, heartfelt. To the woman Henry spoke of each day, he loved you beyond words. He carried your name like a prayer. He tried to return home to you. Please know he did not suffer alone, and he did not leave this world without love. My vision blurred as tears filled my eyes. Not tears of anguish, but tears born of a deep, reverent completeness. All these years, the universe had been holding this truth for me. All these years, something had waited patiently until I was strong enough to hold it. When I looked up, Daniel was watching me quietly, his expression soft with empathy. "You deserved to know," he said. "I did," I whispered. "And now, I finally do." We returned home 2 days later. The journey back felt lighter, as though each mile carried me closer not to the end of a story, but to the beginning of a new one. When I stepped into my house again, the air felt different, clearer, warmer, as though the walls themselves had exhaled. The wedding dress was no longer mine to hide. Henry's letters no longer mine to grieve. The truth no longer mine to fear. And through it all, Daniel remained. Not as a shadow of the past, not as a threat to memory, but as a quiet, steady presence walking beside me with the kind of gentleness that does not ask for anything in return. I found myself watching him sometimes, the way he listened with his whole face, the way he softened his voice when speaking of delicate things, the way he carried his father's guilt not as a burden, but as a vow to honor the man he couldn't save. And slowly, very slowly, a warmth grew inside me that had nothing to do with nostalgia and everything to do with possibility. I didn't rush it. I didn't name it. I didn't fear it. I simply let it be. Weeks passed, then months. Seasons shifted quietly, each one gentler than the last. And one evening, as we sat together on my porch, watching the sun descend behind rooftops bathed in gold, Daniel said something that stayed with me. "You've spent your life carrying a love that never left you. Maybe now, you deserve a love that stays." The words entered me like a warm tide, rising slowly until they reached the quietest corners of my heart. I turned to him, and for the first time, I felt no guilt in the tenderness that bloomed inside me, because some loves do not replace others. They simply lay beside them, soft and steady, filling the spaces that grief once hollowed out. I didn't answer him that evening. I simply rested my hand over his, and he understood everything I could not yet speak. The years that followed were softer than the ones that came before, not because life suddenly became perfect, but because I carried myself differently through it. Healing does not arrive in grand gestures or sudden revelations. It arrives in quiet shifts, in mornings that hurt a little less, in evenings that feel a little lighter, in the simple courage to breathe without bracing for memory's sting. And just as grief had once shaped every corner of my life, now tenderness began to shape the space where grief had lived. Daniel remained by my side, not filling the spaces Henry once occupied, but weaving gently into the spaces time had emptied. Our companionship grew from something small, like a warm ember sheltered in cupped hands, into something steady and bright enough to soften shadows without ever trying to erase them. He never asked for more than I could give, never rushed the pacing of my heart, never feared the depth of the love I once carried. Instead, he honored it, and that, more than anything, allowed me to open myself to what life still wished to offer. One autumn evening, as leaves fell in slow spirals outside my window, I visited the museum again. The dress gleamed softly behind the glass, no longer a symbol of unfinished longing, but a monument of love that had survived far beyond time, distance, or death. Visitors paused reverently before it, some placing their hands against the glass as if sensing the heartbeat woven into its seams. I stood among them quietly, unseen, watching them feel what I had once feared I bore alone. They read Henry's letters. They studied his journal. They lingered as though absorbing the courage of a man who fought not for glory, but for the chance to return to the woman he loved. And in that moment, as the room glowed with the muted warmth of overhead lamps, I understood the true ending of our story. Henry had not vanished into the war. He had not been lost to silence. He had lived, fiercely, faithfully, in every breath of devotion he carried, and now he lived again in every soul who paused before that dress and felt its story press gently against their heart. I left the museum with tears in my eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of gratitude, for the love I had known, for the truth I had discovered, for the pieces of him that had found their way back to me across impossible distances. Years later, when my own time in this world began to quiet, I often sat on the porch beside Daniel, watching sunset spill gold across the sky in the same gentle hues that once lit the dress in my attic. My hands, still steady from a lifetime of sewing, rested over his, and sometimes I wondered how different my life might have been if the war had not taken Henry. But the thought no longer brought pain, only peace, because I realized something Henry had tried to tell me in his final letter. Love is not diminished by its ending. It is honored by the courage to live after it. On the last evening of my life, long after the sun had settled behind the horizon, I felt my breath grow soft, as though the world were easing me into sleep. I sensed Daniel beside me, holding my hand gently, whispering that I had been the bravest woman he had ever known. And as my breaths grew slower, the warmest calm settled over me, the unmistakable feeling of being held by something beyond sight. I saw him, not as a ghost, not as a vision, but as memory made whole. Henry, standing in a field of tall grass, the same field where I had whispered goodbye to the land that held his last steps. His smile was gentle, familiar, filled with the same warmth he had carried in every letter. He reached out a hand, not pulling, not rushing, simply offering. And I realized with a clarity deeper than breath that love does not belong to the past, nor to the living, nor to the dead. It belongs to the space between hearts, where time cannot touch. As I closed my eyes one final time, I felt both of them beside me, the man who had loved me fiercely in youth, and the man who had loved me gently in age. And I understood that my story had never been one of loss. It had always been a story of love, love sewn into fabric, love carried through war, love held through silence, love found again in unexpected places, love that guided me home, in both worlds. And so I left this life as I had lived it, with grace, with courage, and with a heart that had known the rare blessing of loving twice.